The storm raged outside, its fury matching the turmoil brewing within Annabel as she made her way down the dimly lit corridor of the governor's mansion. The heavy air felt oppressive, charged with the weight of an unspoken tension. She had served the family for months without incident, her role as a maid ensuring that she remained largely invisible. But tonight, something was different. A summons had come from the governor himself, a man whose influence and wealth were unrivaled in Charleston. Annabel's heart beat faster with uncertainty as she knocked on his door. Little did she know, this moment would irrevocably alter the course of her life. When the governor beckoned her inside, Annabel felt an icy chill sweep through her body. The room was lavish, decorated with rich velvet curtains and heavy furniture, but the grandiosity of the space seemed to suffocate her as she stood before the governor. His sharp gaze, warm yet calculating, sent a shiver down her spine. He was no stranger to Annabel, but the way he looked at her now felt different. She tried to shake the unease that settled in her chest, dismissing it as nothing more than the nerves that came with being in the presence of such power. However, the governor's next words would confirm her darkest fears. Without warning, the governor moved closer to her, his presence overwhelming and oppressive. He was not the fatherly figure she had always seen him as, but a man driven by desire and something far more dangerous. Annabel, frozen in place, could not escape his grasp. The room seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick and suffocating. The governor's hands were gentle, yet forceful as he pulled her toward him, the intensity of the moment both terrifying and irresistible. Annabel's heart pounded as she fought to control her breath, her body betraying her with every passing second. The storm outside seemed to intensify, mirroring the turmoil within her. As the night unfolded, Annabel found herself swept into an act she never imagined possible. The governor's touch was both tender and brutal, his intentions unclear, but unmistakable. What should have been an act of violence felt like a twisted dance, seductive yet repelling. She wanted to fight back, to scream, but something inside her, whether out of fear or a strange attraction, held her in place. The storm outside raged as if nature itself recoiled from what was happening behind the mansion's closed doors. Annabel's body trembled, not just from the cold of the storm, but from the weight of the moment, a burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. When it was over, Annabel was left breathless and confused, her body aching, her mind swirling with a mix of emotions. The governor, his expression unreadable, seemed to retreat back into the shadows of his power. She could barely find the words to speak, the events of the night crashing over her like waves against the shore. What had just happened? What did this mean for her? But before she could voice any of her questions, the governor dismissed her with a cold, almost indifferent gesture. He no longer looked at her as a servant, but as something else entirely, something she didn't fully understand. Annabel left the room in a daze, her heart racing, her head spinning. The mansion, once a place of safety, now felt like a prison. The silence that followed the storm seemed more oppressive than the noise of the rain. She tried to convince herself that what had just happened was a mistake, that it didn't matter, but deep down, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had changed in ways she could not yet comprehend. The weight of the governor's touch, the look in his eyes, haunted her as she stumbled back to her quarters, the echoes of the storm still vibrating through her mind. As she lay in her bed unable to sleep, Annabel felt the stirrings of something deep within her. A new life, growing quietly, silently. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. She was pregnant. The evidence of the governor's twisted actions was now physically manifesting in her body. The thought of carrying his child made her stomach churn with disgust and dread. But as the days passed, the reality set in. She was trapped by the governor's power, trapped by her own body, and trapped by a future she never asked for. The storm had subsided, but in her soul, the tempest raged on. The news of her pregnancy spread through the mansion like wildfire, and Annabel became the subject of hushed whispers and prying eyes. She tried to keep her secret, but the governor's influence over her was all-encompassing. His presence loomed over her at all times, even in the most mundane moments. The once comforting walls of the mansion now felt suffocating, a reminder of what had happened and what was yet to come. Annabel had never been one for superstition, but as her pregnancy progressed, she couldn't shake the sense that something dark and unnatural was at play. The life growing inside her was not just a reminder of the governor's actions. It was a symbol of her entrapment. As the storm had raged outside, so too had Annabel's life shifted violently. The walls of her world, once familiar, had been torn down, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The governor, with his wealth and power, had entangled her in his web, and now she was bound to him by more than just the child growing inside her. The storm had passed, but the damage had been done. Annabel realized with a sickening certainty that she had no choice but to live with the consequences of that forbidden night. The once distant governor had now become a figure she could never escape, and her future, once filled with possibilities, was now a dark, uncharted path that would lead her into a world she feared to enter. Annabel's pregnancy became impossible to hide. Her body changed in ways that defied explanation, her once slender figure now rounding unnaturally. She tried to cover up her growing belly with loose clothing, but the whispers around the mansion grew louder with each passing day. The maids exchanged looks behind her back, and the gardener gave her pitying glances that made her skin crawl. It seemed as though everyone in the household could sense that something was wrong, but no one dared confront her directly. The governor, whom she had once trusted, had grown distant. His eyes, once warm, now felt cold and calculating whenever they met hers. He would claim to care for her, yet she saw no genuine affection, only a power play she couldn't fully understand. As her pregnancy advanced, the strange dreams began to haunt Annabel more frequently. They started as fleeting images, then morphed into vivid nightmares that gripped her every night. She dreamt of figures cloaked in shadows, speaking in languages she didn't recognize, their whispers laced with warnings and cryptic messages. Each morning she woke, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in fear. She had never been superstitious, but these visions were starting to feel too real to ignore. What was happening to her? Was it the result of the governor's twisted act, or was something far darker at play? She could no longer dismiss the thought that something supernatural had taken root within the mansion's walls. The mansion, once a place of familiarity, had become a prison in every sense of the word. The once grand halls now felt suffocating, the walls closing in on her as if they were alive, watching her every move. The air, once crisp and refreshing, now felt thick and heavy, almost as if it were choking her. She could hear the faintest sound of footsteps following her at times, the echo of an unseen presence trailing her wherever she went. Annabel would spin around in the dark, expecting to see someone, but the hallways would be empty. The sensation of being watched was constant, and it was driving her to the brink of madness. The mansion, once beautiful and majestic, had turned into a cage from which she could see no escape. Her growing belly, once a symbol of life, now felt like a burden, a constant reminder of the horror she had been forced into. She had kept the secret of her pregnancy for so long, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that the secret itself was turning against her. She had no choice but to keep it hidden. But as time passed, the weight of the lie grew unbearable. Each day, the weight of her secret grew heavier until it felt like a physical force pressing down on her chest. She was trapped in her own body, bound by a promise she never made, and she couldn't help but wonder, would she ever be free from this curse? One night, in the dead silence of the mansion, Annabel heard a voice, soft but clear, calling her name. It was low and haunting, echoing through the empty corridors. "Annabel, come closer." The voice sent a chill down her spine, but she couldn't help herself. She followed the sound, her feet moving on their own accord, as if some unseen force was guiding her. She arrived at a dark corner of the mansion, one she had never noticed before. And there, on a forgotten shelf, was a dusty old book. The cover was cracked and the pages yellowed with age. Trembling, she reached for it, feeling an unsettling pull, as though the book had been waiting for her. As Annabelle opened the book, the words seemed to jump off the page, almost as if they were alive. The text was written in a language she didn't recognize, but something deep inside her told her she understood it. The pages spoke of rituals, ancient ceremonies, and the power of bloodlines. She turned the pages faster, her pulse quickening, until one particular phrase caught her eye. "The child of the governor shall unlock the gates of power." Annabelle's breath caught in her throat. What was this book? What had she uncovered? And more importantly, what did it mean for her unborn child? The answers seemed to lie within the pages of the book, but the questions it raised were far more terrifying than anything she had imagined. As Annabelle's due date neared, the atmosphere in the mansion grew increasingly oppressive. The grand halls that once echoed with the sounds of laughter and life now felt cold and desolate. The walls, which had been adorned with elegant tapestries and fine paintings, now seemed to close in on her, their colors fading into dull, lifeless shades. The air itself felt heavier, as though the house was breathing with an unnatural, slow rhythm. Annabelle could hardly bear to stay in any room for too long, as the house seemed to whisper dark secrets in the corners. The windows, which once offered a view of the beautiful gardens, now appeared murky, as though something blocked the light from entering. It was as though the mansion itself was changing along with her, darkening, suffocating. The governor's behavior had also grown strange and unpredictable. He would often watch her with a gaze that felt more like a predator than a protector, his eyes filled with an unsettling intensity. He would follow her around the mansion in silence, only to retreat into his study without a word. At times, he would appear at the most unexpected moments, his presence looming over her, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for the birth of her child, perhaps. Annabelle tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but her growing discomfort was palpable. His increasingly strange and cold demeanor made her question everything she thought she knew about him, about the mansion, and about her own fate. One night, while wandering the dimly lit halls of the mansion, Annabelle stumbled upon an old portrait hidden behind a velvet curtain in a forgotten hallway. The painting was of a woman dressed in the same elegant flowing gown as Annabelle's own wardrobe. The woman's face was eerily familiar, with strikingly similar features. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stared into the eyes of the portrait. She had never seen the woman before, yet there was no mistaking the resemblance. It was uncanny. The woman's eyes, however, held a dark, haunted expression, as though she had witnessed something that had forever altered her soul. Annabelle felt an undeniable connection to the figure in the painting, but the more she looked, the more disturbed she became. In a rising panic, Annabelle decided to confront the governor, demanding an explanation for the portrait she had found. His response was not one of surprise, but rather a cold and calculated response that sent a chill through her entire body. He didn't deny the resemblance, but instead spoke cryptically about the family's dark legacy, a history that had been carefully hidden for generations. His words were cryptic, yet the underlying menace in his tone was unmistakable. "You are more connected to this family than you think, Annabelle," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your child will play a role in something much greater than you can imagine, and you too are a part of this legacy." The governor's words echoed in Annabelle's mind long after their conversation had ended. What did he mean by a role? What dark legacy was he talking about? The more she thought about it, the more her fear began to grow. She couldn't shake the feeling that her pregnancy was part of something far beyond her understanding, something much more sinister. And as the days passed, she began to notice subtle changes within herself as well. Her skin had taken on a pallid, unnatural glow. and her once vibrant eyes now seemed dull and lifeless. She would often experience strange, fleeting sensations, like the feeling of being watched even when no one was around, or hearing faint whispers when there was no one speaking. She had started to wonder if her mind was beginning to unravel, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just in her head. As her pregnancy advanced, the mansion seemed to grow colder still, and her dreams took on a nightmarish quality. The images in her dreams were vivid and terrifying, flashes of rotting corpses, ancient symbols, and images of the same woman from the portrait, her face twisted in agony. Annabelle's once peaceful nights were now filled with horrifying visions that she couldn't escape. Every morning, she woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. She would stare at her reflection in the mirror, struggling to recognize the woman staring back at her. The person in the glass was no longer the same innocent maid who had entered the mansion months ago. The truth was becoming undeniable. Something dark was taking hold of her, and she could feel it in her very bones. The more Annabelle learned about the mansion's dark secrets, the more she began to fear that she was being groomed for a fate worse than she could imagine. Her connection to the family, her growing physical transformation, and the governor's cryptic warnings all pointed to a terrifying truth. She was caught in a web far beyond her control, one that seemed to have been woven long before her arrival. But as much as she feared the unknown, she couldn't turn back. The baby growing inside her was no ordinary child. It was the key to unlocking something ancient, something powerful, and Annabelle was trapped at the center of it all. As Annabelle stood in front of the full-length mirror, her reflection seemed almost unrecognizable. Her once simple maid's attire had been replaced with an elaborate gown of deep red velvet that shimmered under the candlelight. The fabric clung to her growing belly, accentuating the changes that had overtaken her body. Her hair, usually pulled back in a tight bun, cascaded in delicate waves around her shoulders. She had been transformed into a vision of beauty, a stark contrast to the terrified woman she felt inside. But as she gazed at her reflection, a strange unease washed over her. She felt like a doll, a pawn dressed in luxury for a game she did not understand. Despite the grandeur of the evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The ball itself was like a dream, though not a pleasant one. As she entered the grand hall, the room fell silent for a brief moment, and all eyes turned toward her. Annabelle's breath caught in her throat as she was presented to the guests, many of them wealthy, powerful figures who gazed at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The governor, standing by her side, proudly introduced her as the evening's centerpiece. The words felt hollow, and the look in his eyes, once cold and distant, now held something darker, more possessive. He guided her through the throngs of guests, his grip tight on her arm, his gaze lingering on her in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. As the night wore on, Annabelle was swept away by the dizzying pace of the ball. She danced with men she didn't recognize, each one more eager than the last to gaze upon her with admiration. Her beauty had become almost otherworldly, as though she were a creature from another time or place. Yet as she danced, she could not shake the feeling that the night was not just about her. There was something else happening, something darker than she could comprehend. The air in the room grew thick, the candles flickering as if they were being disturbed by an unseen force. She began to feel lightheaded, her mind clouded with an inexplicable dread. Every now and then, she would catch sight of figures in the corners of the room, shadowy figures watching her with unsettling interest. By the time midnight struck, Annabelle's discomfort had reached its peak. Her once confident movements now felt stiff, controlled as if her body were no longer her own. She tried to excuse herself, but the governor's presence was overwhelming. He was no longer just the man who had seduced her. He was now the puppet master, pulling the strings of her every action. He told her she was the jewel of the night, the embodiment of beauty and grace, but his words held an edge that made her skin crawl. There was something unnatural in his gaze, as though he saw her not as a person, but as a vessel, something to be used for his own purposes. Annabelle, with growing horror, realized that she was being treated not as a woman, but as an object for display. The guests, enchanted by her beauty, began to murmur among themselves, speaking in low tones that she couldn't quite catch. It was as if the room had become a stage, and she, the unwilling actress, was trapped in a play she hadn't chosen to star in. As the night wore on, Annabelle began to feel a strange compulsion, an overwhelming urge to comply with the expectations around her. She had become the belle of the ball, but the crown she wore was one of thorns, not jewels. She could feel her body betraying her pregnancy causing her discomfort, yet the governor continued to lead her through the night with a sense of purpose, as if everything were unfolding exactly as it had been planned. The final dance arrived, and Annabelle found herself in the governor's arms once again. This time, however, the air around them seemed to shift. His hands, once gentle, now felt like shackles holding her in place. The music swelled, but Annabelle could no longer hear the melody. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart and the whispering thoughts in her head, urging her to flee, to escape the suffocating grip of the governor and his world. But there was nowhere to run. The guests had formed a circle around them, watching with predatory eyes, and Annabelle realized that she was the centerpiece of a twisted ritual, one that involved far more than just a simple ball. As the dance continued, Annabelle's vision began to blur, the room spinning around her. The laughter of the guests grew muffled, like a distant echo, as though she was sinking into the very floor beneath her. She felt as though she were losing herself in the dance, becoming a part of the night itself. The governor's voice, low and urgent, whispered in her ear, "This is your destiny, Annabelle. You were always meant for this." The words sent a chill through her, and in that moment she understood that she was no longer just a maid or a mother-to-be. She was part of something ancient, something cursed, and there was no turning back. As the clock struck the final hour of the ball, the guests erupted in applause, but Annabelle barely heard them. The lights flickered and the music ceased. The governor smiled at her, but it was a smile devoid of warmth or affection. It was the smile of a man who had just claimed his prize. And in that moment, Annabelle knew with absolute certainty that she had become a pawn in a game that stretched far beyond her understanding, a game in which her life, her body, and her child were no longer hers to control. Annabelle's mind raced as she leafed through the governor's journal, the candlelight flickering as shadows danced across the walls of his private quarters. The pages were old and worn, but the words were chillingly clear. The journal detailed the dark pact the governor's family had made centuries ago, an exchange of blood for eternal power. Each generation had been bound to this malevolent force, a twisted entity that promised immortality in return for the lives of their children. The family had prospered for years, their influence stretching far and wide, but at a grave cost. Annabelle felt sick to her stomach as she realized that her own child was part of this horrific bargain. Her pregnancy was not a blessing, it was the next link in a cursed chain. As the weight of the truth settled over her, Annabelle's pulse quickened. Her baby wasn't just a symbol of her sin, but a pawn in an ancient game. The governor's ancestors had passed down this dark legacy, and now she had unknowingly become a part of it. Her child, the innocent life she had hoped to protect, was destined to fulfill the pact. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had been chosen for this curse, not by the governor's will alone, but by some malevolent force that had controlled her every move from the very beginning. Annabelle felt the walls of the room close in on her, the journal's contents suffocating her as the truth sank deeper. Flipping through more pages, Annabelle uncovered a disturbing pattern. Every few generations, a child born to the governor's family would be sacrificed in a dark ritual that perpetuated the pact. The child's soul would be claimed by the ancient force, ensuring that the family remained in power for another century. The ritual was not just symbolic, it was a physical act of power exchange. The family's bloodline remained unbroken, their wealth and influence unchallenged, but at the expense of the children they bore. Annabel shuddered as she imagined what would happen to her baby if she failed to break the cycle. Her child's life would be forfeit, sacrificed to an entity she could not even comprehend. With trembling hands, Annabel continued to read. The journal contained names and dates, generations of children born into the governor's family, each marked by their fate. The curse was older than the mansion itself, older than Charleston, perhaps older than time. There was no escaping it. The journal described how, over time, the family had become numb to the horrors they committed, justifying it as a means of preserving their legacy. The more Annabel read, the more she understood the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded in the governor's lineage. She was not just an unwilling participant, she was the latest victim of a centuries-old curse that had ruined the lives of so many before her. Annabel's heart raced as she turned the final pages of the journal, only to find a horrifying revelation. The curse could not be broken by mere defiance. The family's pact was a binding contract with an ancient entity, and it demanded compliance. If Annabel tried to escape, she would not only condemn her child, but herself as well. The entity would claim both their lives, and the governor's family would be cursed forever. There was no salvation, no way to undo the pact. Annabel's child was already marked for sacrifice, just as she had been from the moment she stepped foot into the governor's mansion. The walls seemed to close in tighter, as if the very air around her was thick with the weight of her inevitable fate. As the night wore on, Annabel felt a growing sense of dread. The mansion, which had once seemed like a grand place of opulence and power, now felt like a tomb. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every creaking floorboard a whisper of what had been done. The governor's family, with their wealth and influence, had never known true peace. Their lives were tethered to an ancient evil that demanded more than they were willing to give. Annabel understood now that she was caught in the same web of darkness, a pawn in a game that spanned centuries. Her fate, her child's fate, had been sealed long before she had ever crossed paths with the governor. Annabel felt her heart pound in her chest as the reality of her situation took hold. She could no longer hide from the truth. The family she had worked for, the life she had hoped to build, was nothing more than a mask for a terrible secret. Her child was bound to a fate that no mother should ever have to face, and there was no escaping it. She could flee, but where would she go? The governor's influence stretched far beyond the walls of the mansion, and the curse was too powerful to escape. She had no allies, no way to break free from the grip of the ancient force that controlled her every move. The question now wasn't whether she could save her child, but whether she could survive long enough to even try. The journal was a damning testament to the horrors she had uncovered, and yet Annabel knew that this knowledge was both a blessing and a curse. She could no longer deny what had been done, what was happening to her, and what would inevitably happen to her child. But there was one thing she could control. She could choose how to face the inevitable. Annabel made a silent vow to herself. She would not go quietly into the night. Whatever it took, she would fight for her child, even if it meant confronting the terrifying forces that had held the governor's family in thrall for so long. Annabel's heart raced as she sprinted through the dimly lit halls of the mansion, her breath quick and shallow. The weight of her pregnancy, once a symbol of life, now felt like a chain pulling her down. Each step echoed loudly in the cavernous space, but no matter how fast she moved, it felt like the walls were closing in. The mansion, once a place of grandeur and beauty, now felt like a trap, its dark corners alive with an oppressive force. Every corner she turned led her to another dead end. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, and Annabel could no longer shake the feeling that she was being watched by invisible eyes, the very walls breathing down her neck. As Annabel's panic mounted, the temperature in the mansion seemed to drop. A chill crept up her spine, and the flickering candlelight cast long, jagged shadows on the walls. Suddenly, from the darkness, the governor stepped forward. His tall frame loomed in the doorway, his cold eyes piercing through her. He had appeared as if from nowhere, his presence as chilling as the house itself. He didn't need to say a word. His gaze alone made her heart skip a beat. He was not just a man, he was something more, something ancient and unyielding. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that no matter where she ran, he would always be there, lurking just out of sight. The governor's voice cut through the silence, low and measured. "You can't escape, Annabelle. You never could." His words struck her like a slap, and she recoiled, her mind scrambling for a way out. But he continued, his tone colder, harder. "The curse is not just on the child, it's on you too. You are bound to this family, to this mansion, for eternity. Every step you take, every breath you draw is under its shadow. There is no escaping it. You are part of the family's legacy now, whether you want to be or not." Annabelle's knees buckled beneath her, the full weight of his words sinking in. This was her reality now. She was trapped forever. The governor's voice became softer, almost pitying. "There's only one way to break the curse, Annabelle, but you must understand, it's a choice that will change everything." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Give up the child, and the curse will be lifted. You will be free. Your child, however, will not be. They will be taken from you, consumed by the same force that has consumed our family for generations." Annabelle felt her stomach twist at the thought of losing her child, but the governor's words didn't stop there. "But keep the child, and you will be condemned to a life of torment, just as I have been. Your soul will be shackled to this house, to this curse forever." A cold shiver ran down Annabelle's spine. The governor's words were a poison, seeping into her soul. She didn't know which was worse, losing her child or condemning herself to an eternity of suffering. Her mind was clouded with fear and confusion, the weight of the decision suffocating her. Every part of her screamed to protect her child, to defy the curse, to fight against the nightmare she had found herself in. But she knew deep down that her fight was futile. The governor's power was beyond anything she could comprehend. He had warned her, and she now realized that no matter what choice she made, the consequences would be dire. The mansion around her seemed to close in, the walls shifting as though they were alive, responding to the curse that bound her. The very ground beneath her feet seemed unstable, as if it too was shifting in response to the impossible decision she had to make. Annabelle's heart hammered in her chest as she looked at the governor, whose gaze never wavered. She felt her body tremble, her mind lost in a haze of fear and indecision. The lines between past and future blurred in an instant, and Annabelle realized that no matter what path she chose, she would be forever tied to this nightmare. There was no salvation, only a choice between two evils. As she stood there, trembling, her eyes fixed on the governor, Annabelle knew that she had to make a decision. The choice she made would define not just her life, but her child's life, and the lives of countless others who had fallen prey to the curse before her. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, suffocating her. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows creeping closer, as if the mansion itself was waiting for her answer. She could hear the whispers of the past, the cries of those who had made this choice before her, all doomed by the same fate. And yet she stood there, alone, caught between the forces of fate and free will. Annabelle's mind raced, the clock ticking louder in her ears with every passing second. She had always known that her life was not her own, that the choices she had made had led her to this very moment. But now, as she stood on the edge of a decision that could change everything, she understood that there was no turning back. The governor, the mansion, the curse, they were all part of a story that had been written long before her birth. She was just a player, a pawn in a game that was beyond her control. The only question now was whether she would accept her role in the tragedy that had been set in motion or try to defy it, knowing the cost. Annabelle's mind swirled with confusion and terror as the days passed. The mansion, once a symbol of grandeur, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her with every breath. Her body was growing weaker, each step heavier than the last, but the child inside her seemed to pulse with unnatural strength. Her thoughts were no longer her own. The curse, once a distant terror, now seemed to wrap around her like a suffocating cloak. She could feel the governor's presence lurking in the shadows, watching her with cold, calculating eyes. His once human features now seemed distorted, twisted, as though he was no longer fully of this world. The reality of her situation was overwhelming, and she struggled to retain even the smallest shred of clarity. The mansion felt alive, its creaking timbers groaning like a living, breathing creature. Every room seemed darker than the last, the air thick with the weight of centuries-old secrets. Annabelle could no longer differentiate between dreams and waking life, as the line between the two grew thinner with each passing hour. She heard whispers in the halls, heard footsteps behind her, but when she turned, there was no one there. Her own reflection in the mirror had started to look unfamiliar, as though her very essence was slipping away. The child inside her was no longer just a child. It was something far more powerful, something ancient, something tied to the cursed legacy of the governor's family. The governor, once an imposing figure, now seemed like something out of a nightmare. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, his skin stretched tight over his bones, as though he was a mere shell of his former self. His presence was suffocating, an unholy force that seemed to warp the very air around him. Annabelle's heart would race whenever he entered the room, but she could no longer escape him. His voice, low and gravelly, seemed to pierce her very soul as he spoke of the curse, of the bloodline, of the power they had both inherited. He told her she was a part of something far bigger than herself, that her fate was sealed long before she was born. In those final days, Annabelle's mind fractured. The child inside her, no longer an innocent life, began to communicate with her in strange, cryptic whispers. Her body twisted with painful contractions as the darkness within her grew stronger. Annabelle could feel it. The malevolent force that had been feeding off her soul for so long, twisting her into something she didn't recognize. Her own thoughts felt like an alien presence, the curse slowly taking over every part of her being. She knew she had little time left, and the terrible weight of her fate settled heavily on her shoulders. The mansion was no longer just a house, it was a tomb, and she was its prisoner. Desperation gripped Annabelle as she realized the truth. She had to end the cycle. She could no longer let the curse continue. She knew the cost, but she also knew that it was the only way to protect her child from a fate far worse than death. With trembling hands, she prepared for the final ritual, a desperate act that would sever the bond between her and the curse. But as she lit the candles and began the incantation, the mansion seemed to come alive around her, its walls shaking, its foundation trembling, as if the very earth was fighting against her. The governor's laughter echoed through the halls, a sound that was both triumphant and mocking. Annabelle's thoughts became muddled as she recited the ancient words, but she felt an undeniable pull toward the ritual's end. The child inside her thrashed, as if sensing the change, its power growing with each passing moment. The mansion's walls creaked and groaned, as if the house itself were alive and trying to prevent her from finishing. The governor, his monstrous form looming in the doorway, watched in silence. The curse had reached its apex, and with a final heart-wrenching scream, Annabelle completed the ritual. But as she did, the mansion began to collapse around her, the walls cracking, the floors splintering. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The world around her shattered. The mansion crumbled into ruins, the once immense structure now reduced to rubble. As the dust settled, a chilling silence fell over the land. Annabelle's final breath echoed in the stillness, her sacrifice sealing her fate and the fate of her child. The curse had not been broken, but rather it had evolved. The governor's legacy, twisted and corrupted, lived on in the ruins of the mansion. Annabelle's name would fade into the annals of history, forgotten by the world, but her story would never be erased. Her tragic end would forever haunt the ruins of the mansion, a dark reminder of the cursed bloodline that had once held such power. And so the curse continued, a never-ending cycle of torment and despair, feeding off the lives of those who dared cross its path. The governor's family, once wealthy and powerful, had vanished into the shadows, but their legacy lived on. The mansion, now just a crumbling ruin, was a testament to the dark power that had once thrived within its walls. And as the winds howled through the broken windows and the moonlight cast eerie shadows on the ground, it was clear that the curse was far from over. The cycle would continue, and no one would be safe from its reach.